All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the November edition of our professional development series for teaching and learning for Catch the Next. It is my great pleasure to introduce Allegra Villarreal, as well as her colleague, Diana Mastracci, and they will be presenting and sharing their knowledge. So I will keep an eye out on the Q&A. The floor is yours, and then at the end we will have what will no doubt be a great discussion. So Allegra, it's off to you, Indiana.
All right, sounds good. Thank you all for having us here. I know we're kind of a small group here, but I'll keep it mindful that we're going to be recorded, and so keep it for a broader audience as well. Yeah, so we're really honored to be here in the space. Ascender obviously is very near and dear to my heart as a program. And I wanted to introduce this session, some new work that I've been doing with one of my oldest and dearest friends, Diana, because she's a brilliant human being, and because I thought that I wanted to bring her work into this space so you all could enjoy it. And also to inspire us to think about some new approaches and new ideas for our classrooms. So that's what we'll be doing today. Okay. So before we launch into content, I do want to take a moment to do land acknowledgement. This is Native American Heritage Month. It's Indigenous Peoples Month here in the US. Next week will be the National Day of Mourning, and we are talking about decolonizing and indigenizing education in this presentation. So I know land acknowledgements have become a little bit in vogue, and we see them in different spaces. So I want to give a little bit of background, and then I'll do the land acknowledgement, and then we'll go right into our content. So let's take a moment together to reflect on the land on which we work and live. The definition is here for what a land acknowledgement is, but just to emphasize, land acknowledgements are formal statements that recognize and respect all Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territories we reside on, and as a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on this land since time immemorial. As part of this acknowledgement, it is important to remember the brutal history of forced expulsion and attempts at the elimination of Indigenous peoples in order for a settler society to develop on these unceded territories. Acknowledging the land before speaking is rooted in Indigenous protocol, and a powerful way of showing respect to Indigenous communities today is by supporting Indigenous sovereignty. So with that, here in Austin, Texas, we acknowledge that we are on the occupied ancestral territories of the Tonkawa, the Panapachi, Karankawa, Comanche, and Coahuiltecan people. We also want to acknowledge and give respect to the various Indigenous peoples and nations who live on the land we now call Texas, specifically the Mikan Garza Band, the Top Pilam Coahuiltecan Nation, the Kirikish people, the Seminole people, the Umano Nation of Texas, the Carrizo Comecrudo tribe of Texas, the Texas Band of Yaqui Indians, the Alabama Coshata tribe of Texas, the Kickapoo traditional tribe of Texas, and the Isleta del Sur Pueblo. We recognize Indigenous peoples regardless of federal state recognition, and we understand that this list is not exhaustive, and that there are many names and nations of people that history is still working to recover and include. So with all of that, and I think kind of deeply connected to that, is this central tenet of Indigenous pedagogies that Diana's going to be touching upon a little bit later. One of the sayings in this practice is that water is life and land is our first teacher. And I wanted to start the presentation with this because at first glance, this is a really simple statement, but there are a lot of implications underneath this. And this is going to be a rather sprawling presentation initially. My part is going to be rather sprawling. So I want to continue to come back to this idea because I think it's a really powerful one. And we're going to be looking at a lot of theory. So just to put a pin in this, and imagine as educators, if we really took this to heart, this principle of land being our first teacher, how would that change our practice as educators? So just kind of putting a pin on that, and Diana's going to be picking that up a little bit later. Our objectives for this session are to explore climate change in classroom and curriculum, like how we can introduce this, how we can work with these ideas with our students, to discuss decolonizing education and its implications on our practice as educators, to relate that theory of decolonizing and indigenizing education to climate action, through examples from the field, and to share resources for further reading and course design. So that's what we have planned for you all. So a couple of weeks ago, I gave a presentation here for the Ascender fall seminar here in Austin. And I began my sessions with this key question. And this is the key question that I ask myself at the beginning of every semester when I think about how I want to teach my students and what I think will be most relevant for them in their lives. And it is this one. What would I need if I were a student in this historical moment? And as you can imagine, the answers to these questions change semester to semester. But go ahead and drop something in the chat box if you have an answer to this. I mean, imagining, what would I need if I were a student in this historical moment? You can drop a word or a phrase or a sentence, anything like that. What are your thoughts on this? And I'll give you a minute. Patience, reassurance, guiding you in compassion, flexibility. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is all very, very connected to what I was hearing in person a few weeks ago. So some of the things that people were saying was, oh, students need resilience and they need empathy, they need critical thinking, they need self-compassion, they need space, they need space and time. So all of these things kind of came up. Yeah, sense of belonging, and to know who I am. Yeah, absolutely. I think in some ways, this question has led me to this presentation and to rethinking my practice around things like climate change. So I appreciate all of your responses. And this idea of asking this question of myself actually comes from an approach that I learned about over a decade ago in a Catch the Next training in Berkeley from an incredible educator named David Mills in Norco College. And he was talking about how he designed his English classes. And I never forget what he said, because he said, the one thing students come to our classes to explore are the big questions in life. Like, they don't come to college to learn how to cite a peer-reviewed article. They come to college to find the questions that we all hold within ourselves. And he advocated that the more that educators can appeal to these big questions or these big themes, the more that we can embed these in our courses, the better the classes will be, the more engaged students will be, the more meaningful the learning experience will be for us and for our students. And I can say that this has consistently been true for me. When I find myself as a teacher kind of getting into the nitty-gritty about really minor things, I have to pull myself back and go, but really, is this why my students are here with me in this space? To learn this? Or is there something else? Or is there a way that I can frame this in a bigger way? So over the years, many of my students, when they're given the opportunity to do open topic research, they focus on climate change. And they want to dig deep into this area. And I don't think it's surprising because climate change really does connect to all of these other issues in society. We can explore ecology, of course, but also philosophy and politics and biology and data science and literature. It's a subject that invites also like analyses of power that students are increasingly wanting to engage with. And systemic issues, because the core question of who is safer from climate change and who isn't and why are really big questions. And, we talk a lot in their trainings about culturally relevant materials or culturally relevant pedagogy. And there's really two parts to that. There's the cultural part, which is really important. It's a really big piece. But there's also the relevant part. And I do think that this topic is really relevant for our students. It's relevant for everybody, but especially for younger generations right now. All right, and just to kind of emphasize this point, there was a survey that was completed a year ago across 10 countries of 16 to 25-year-olds. And it found that climate change really is top of mind for them. So 59% of 16 to 25-year-olds were extremely or very worried about climate change. And that was kind of defined as they're thinking about it every single day. 75% agreed with the statement, the future is frightening. And 83% believe that people have failed to take care of the planet. And actually, the researchers of this study were themselves surprised at kind of the severity and the distress. And there's actually terms for this now. Eco-grief is one, eco-anxiety is another one. And, again, I wanted to bring it into this space because we talk a lot about the importance of mental health in our schools and our universities. And I think we can't really ignore anymore this aspect of kind of existential fear. Again, that all people, I think, have on some level, but especially younger generations are really grappling with at this historical moment. Just as an aside as well, kind of some things that I found as I was putting this together. there have been several surveys by Pew and this one by Yale that find that Latinos are one of the most engaged groups on climate change. So here it says Latinos are much more engaged with the issues of global warming than are non-Latinos. Latinos are more convinced global warming is happening in human cause, more worried about it, perceive a greater risk, are more supportive of climate change policies, and are more willing to get involved politically. And the whole study is really fascinating, and I'm going to share a resource at the very end that has a link to this. But I mean, there have been a lot of answers or speculation as to why this is. Many proposed answers to this trend, but I wanted to surface it here as an aside, because when we talk about environmentalism and activism, oftentimes the image that we have is sort of a middle to upper white class kind of society of like this type of people are the ones who are the most concerned about climate change. And actually surveys show that it's the opposite. It's minoritized communities who are the most impacted and the most concerned. And Diana's going to pick this up a little bit, talking specifically about Indigenous communities a little bit later on. But, you know, when we think about the impacts of climate change, if we're talking about lack of green spaces or natural disasters or air pollution or water contamination, this is affecting our communities. And so, yeah, I wanted to just to surface it here with you all. One way that I have found as an interesting way of bringing students into this conversation. Yes, Erin, yeah, we're still defining this term and figuring out what exactly the activism behind this will be. But yeah, this is one way that I've used to kind of bring students into this conversation. This is like a little mini comic that's based on a kind of a mini narrative podcast of an environmental activist talking about just what are the effects in her community. And, you know, I'm a big fan of like writing art kind of projects. And so having my students do projects like this is to just document what's happening in your community, what's happening in your neighborhood. What have you noticed that's different from when you were a child to when you are now? So I wanted to share that with you all as just kind of a starting point into that conversation for students that I think is really impactful. Okay, so coming back into surveys. So students clearly care about this, but also parents really care about this of K through 12 students. So 80% of parents think that climate change is something that should be taught in schools. 86% of teachers agree with them, but 60% of teachers say that they don't teach climate change or mention the subject in their classes because they believe it's outside of their subject area. And this might be a position that you all are feeling right now as well. You know, I think I oftentimes, even though this was coming up a lot in my classroom, it was coming out through my students' papers, I thought, well, that's really the purview of science teachers. That's not really something that I have to like deal with. And the truth is that we're all dealing with it. And I think, you know, I have a little schematic here about the idea of, you know, really we need a transdisciplinary approach. Arts and humanities have to be part of the conversation too, just as natural sciences, just as social sciences, and just as additional knowledges. So when we talk about funds of knowledge, you know, that's also not just what's found in the written word, but, you know, it's often said that Indigenous literacy is based on reading the cosmos, and that's also part of the knowledge base. So when all of these come together, they can potentially strengthen what's being called like green skills. These are the capacities needed to contribute to a socially, economically, and environmentally just human society that cares for the human and non-human world and reduces the impact of human activity on others. That's how this is defined. And so what you'll see here on the left-hand side are the skills for green jobs. So we've heard about this, right? The green new future, green new jobs. What is this going to be about? And these are really technical skills, right? So when you hear about it, we typically hear, oh, well, students are going to need engineering skills, and they're going to need ICT skills, and they're going to need management skills and entrepreneurship and things like this, which are really technical and can be taught, need to be maintained over time. But yeah, these are the kind of the technical ones. Down the middle, though, are where it starts to get a little bit more interesting in terms of transdisciplinary approaches, because what we see down the middle are the skills that we commonly call soft skills that we think, especially in the SNDEP program, are really important for students to develop in our courses. Things like what you mentioned at the beginning of this presentation: empathy, flexibility, growth mindset, resilience, teamwork, all of the things that we really seek to foster in our classrooms. So those are green life skills. Those are skills that are lifelong ones that need to constantly be developed and grown and are part of self-actualization. And then we have on the right-hand side here where it gets really interesting, I think where we all as educators are most energized in our work, and this is skills for green transformation. So this is what we'll be talking about mostly in this presentation. We're talking about, you know, how do we get students to be able to be hopeful in the face of the future so that they can design the solutions that we need to this really challenging moment. How do we teach political agency and activism? How do we teach solidarity and systems thinking? And how do we embed traditional indigenous knowledges as part of that approach? So that's where the work gets really interesting for us. And so I asked you all, as you're thinking about what you're doing in your courses, thinking about, how are those green life skills embedded? Because they are. Like, how can we get over to that column of the green transformative skills? How is that also showing up in the coursework that we're doing? Now, having said this, there are some barriers to education on climate action, and these have been outlined by Vandana Singh in this particular study, but they're echoed across a lot of the literature. So the first barrier to effective climate education is what Vandana Singh calls knowledge pollution and ignorance. So students' prior knowledge, their thoughts and their feelings about this issue often mirror public confusion and misunderstanding. Obviously, we live in a society. It's really hard, misinformation, disinformation is a big issue. And of course, oftentimes, because of what we talked about with that previous survey of K through 12, students haven't had a solid foundational grounding in high school about these issues. And so that's one barrier. Another one is transdisciplinarity. So the problem of climate change has multiple ramifications across economic, historical, sociological spheres, as well as, of course, social justice. And our siloed kind of compartmentalized ways of our universities, of our school systems, don't necessarily allow for working across disciplines, working together, dovetailing assignments and curriculum in ways that would be meaningful to confront this challenge. Oftentimes we have different terminology too, so we're talking about the same thing and don't realize we're talking about the same thing across disciplines. And Diana and I have talked about that a lot because she works a lot with science communities. So it's different kind of communicating in the sciences than it is in the social sciences or in the arts and humanities. The third that is outlined here is what are called onto-epistemological barriers or psychosocial barriers. Many scholars of transformative education have pointed out that in order to really confront climate change, we have to change entire frameworks and paradigms. Because what we're working in right now, modern industrial cultures tend to default towards short-term and linear ways of thinking. And so this paradigm blindness is kind of a blight, because we need to actually have the meetings of, we need to have complex, nonlinear thinking as well as part of this kind of in line with our current systems. And so that can be really challenging. The fourth are the psychosocial barriers that I mentioned. So, our students are directly feeling the impacts of climate change now. We all are, right? The world is getting hotter. And there are extreme weather events. I can't tell you how many students I've had who were relocated to Austin because of hurricanes and recurrent hurricanes. I had one student who lived through 3 major hurricanes in her 18 years of life. So we know that those have mental health effects, of course. But it's also really challenging for students to confront these data sets about what the world looks like and what the projections are. Like, that can create a lot of fear and despair and anxiety. And oftentimes we as faculty are not really set up to deal with that in the moment, like in the classroom. And so there's additional training that's probably needed in that area, which leads me to this, faculty training and institutional barriers. So lack of that supportive teacher training around these issues and around kind of more broadly our student mental health issues is a barrier. And, additionally, like, there's these structural barriers, right? So a lot of us, obviously, if we're involved in Ascender, we know what it is to be in a learning community with another instructor or a group of instructors, but that's really on us to oftentimes to decide, like, okay, how much do I want to work with your curriculum and my curriculum together? So it's oftentimes sort of we're determining what that relationship looks like, rather than our institution saying, hey, let's really support you in this work. Like, we really think that transdisciplinarity is important. So these are the 5 barriers to effective climate action. I think that for me, when I read them, they were super resonant in terms of how I have conceptualized this. So we come to this now. There is, it obviously goes without saying, there's a deep moral conundrum here that underlies this whole discussion, especially when we speak about sort of those epistemological and those psychosocial barriers. We know that as global warming continues and the climate changes, those who did the least to cause the harm will suffer first and will suffer most. And that's just the kind of the reality that we're dealing with. And that's sort of, I think, a lot of the feelings of guilt, of shame, the moral aspect of it is real and it's true. And this is what gets then to the roots of when we talk about decolonization, right? So, and we've heard this in all sorts of different spheres. So there is like decolonized conservation, decolonized environmentalism. And this is an acknowledgement of two things. The first is that there's a greater responsibility, obviously, on certain nations than others for this work. So former colonial empires, settler colonial states such as the US, as a result of the historical inequities perpetuated by imperialism and colonial domination. And secondly, we are seeking alternative models to these extractive systems. So because of these two reasons, we have this word decolonization, this term, this movement kind of coming into a lot of different spaces. And so I'm going to deconstruct it a little bit here before we turn it over to Diana. So just to backtrack, at various points over the last 500 years, all but 4 countries were colonized by European powers. Most fell under just 5 countries: Spain, Portugal, Britain, Belgium, and France. Later on, Italy, the Netherlands, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States and Denmark also engaged in colonial expansion and exploitation. So literally decolonization, literally like in the most literal sense, is obviously the process by which these former colonies assert their independence and reclaim their territories from the external powers. So this is literally what it means. It's to return unceded territories back to the original inhabitants. And I emphasize this because when we hear it kind of in general conversation, it's been applied to a lot of things. Like I've heard of like decolonize your diet, like which is not exactly the same thing as returning unceded territories to their original inhabitants. So there's a lot of criticism of the overuse of this term, most notably in Tuck and Yang's Decolonization Is Not a Metaphor, which I highly recommend as a read in and of itself. And in that article, they argue that this is not a synonym for other social justice movements. It's not a metaphor in this way. It is what it is. It's the returning of lands. Having said that, in educational spaces, you've probably heard this with reference to these terms, like decolonize your classroom, decolonize your syllabus, the canon, the academy. And this does point to, we do have a two-pronged use of this term, generally speaking. And that's because many decolonization scholars and post-colonial writers have critiqued Western worldviews that and promoting the decolonization of knowledge and the centering of traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, T-E-K. So there's a part of this which is the returning of lands and repatriation, and there's a part of this that refers to raising critical consciousness. And both are happening as we speak, both in both senses of the term. So the concept of decolonizing the mind, that term or that phrase was made most famous by Tiongo in his book about language and culture in Africa. And that was in many ways building on Frantz Fanon's arguments from Wretched of the Earth. And what he said in that book was that, colonialism wasn't just concerned about politics and economics and land, but it was about consciousness itself. So he had a background in psychology and sociology, and that led him to the argument that, and the conclusion that colonized people, in order to survive and thrive in such a system, had to emulate and imitate the ideas and cultures of their oppressors, which ultimately leads to the belief that the oppressor's culture, language, religion, traditions, and customs are superior. So a lot about what we talk about with culturally sustaining pedagogies and culturally relevant literature is really restoration practices, in some ways in response to what Fanon was talking about. And of course, I think we're all familiar with Freire's work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He cited Fanon, and he asserted that, education is freedom, and that education, the purpose of education, the main purpose of education was to decolonize the mind, decolonize the minds of young people through the cultivation of that critical consciousness, enabling them to reflect on their own reality and then be able to transform it. So to decolonize the mind is to empower the mind with the ability to self-represent, to understand one's history, to write one's own history, and to create one's own representation. And this is a quote, I think, that kind of is a really great definition of it, just to kind of sum up. So decolonizing pedagogies and practices open up spaces with the learning environment where students can question their own positionalities, prior knowledge, biases, and taken for granted assumptions, together with the ways they are implicated in and or affected by colonial relations of privilege and power. So that's kind of the succinct definition. So that was a lot. That was I promised you it would be sprawling. So it was a lot of different things, but I wanted to establish why I think that climate action should be brought into our classroom, should be discussed, should be something that we wrestle with together with our students, and also a little bit of theory on decolonization. But with this, I'm going to pass it over to Diana, who's going to give us some more examples of enactment. And yeah, we'll see you towards the end with some resources and stuff as well. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Allegra, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be with you here today. So Allegra has left us with this concept of decolonizing education. And this is often paired with indigenizing education, but they're not the same thing. And here is a definition from Leanne Simpson from Land as Pedagogy. Indigenization means change led by indigenous people to bring indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing into spaces that are not designed for those ways. So at the beginning of this presentation, we referenced this foundational tenet of indigenizing education. The land is our first teacher. And as an example of this, I had the privilege to work for many years in the Alaskan Arctic with Inupiaq communities, and I was often told that the classroom is the land. In that context, as subsistence hunters, the elders used to teach their children about how to survive on the sea ice when they were out on the land. However, when their children went into public school, this became more challenging because the academic year begins in September, and that's when the sea ice starts to form. And so they're in school in this really crucial time when historically they would have been learning from the land out on the ice. So the community requested that the school calendar be adjusted, but the teacher, who most of them were from the lower 48 states, wanted the summer off. So this is an example of how indigenous communities are often required to give up their customs and to conform to systems that are not suited to the passing of their traditional knowledges. An indigenizing approach instead would allow for both systems, the public school system and the indigenous ways of life, to coexist. Next slide, please, Allegra. So why now? Indigenous people play a key role in protecting biodiversity. Despite being less than 5% of the world's population, they conserve over 80% of the world's biodiversity. So there is really an urgent need for indigenous pedagogies that enhances the community's transfer of knowledge between their elders and the youth to ensure that the next generation is resilient in the face of climate change. And as Priscilla Solis Ibarra from a quote from Good Life Writing, it is time to stop pretending that ideas for healing the relationship between humans and the natural environment need to be new or originate in Anglo-American writings, when they can be found in the heart of a thriving culture that has stared down assault and assimilation and won. Next slide, please. So despite the crucial role that indigenous people's contributions play to climate change mitigation and adaptation, however, they still face struggles to protect their land and livelihoods. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has recognized that strengthening the rights of indigenous people is a critical solution to the climate crisis. Indigenous people customarily manage more than 50% of the world's landmass, but legally they own only 10%. So securing land rights and closing this gap represent the greatest opportunity for climate action. And further action is really urgently needed to support the legal recognition of indigenous people's collective and resource rights, to ensure that indigenous people are equal partners in policy development, and to achieve the full adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, which promotes the full and effective participation of indigenous people in all matters that affect them. Next slide, please. And the G-Indigenous Alliance, that is an Indigenous alliance that I was honored to co-found in Canberra, Australia in 2019, together with Indigenous leaders from around the world, is tackling these very issues. The aim of the alliance is to promote the access and use of Earth observation data. Earth observation data is data that includes images taken from satellites in the sky, all the way to weather data from stations on the ground. So we promote the use of this Earth observation data among indigenous and underrepresented communities for climate action. And we follow and use these protocols grounded in Indigenous values and worldviews in our projects. And we're currently developing training materials on Indigenous engagement, convening advisory groups of Indigenous representatives, and developing Geo-Indigenous Alliance principles of engagement, as well as an Indigenous impact assessment. Next slide, please. And to advance science education and to ensure everyone benefits from it, we must address structural barriers that prevent science from being truly open to everyone. And one way we bridge Indigenous ways of knowing with Western scientific methodologies and advance science education is through the Indigenous hackathons. This is an innovative Indigenous methodology that unlocks the power of technology by taking into consideration the community's desire to increase intercultural communication between their youth and scientists, intergenerational knowledge transfer between the elders and the youth, and enhance local culture. For example, we've been running Indigenous hackathons every year for the past 7 years. And during COVID, we held the Geo-Indigenous Hack for COVID event where hundreds of people, hackers from all over the world joined from over 35 countries to develop solutions for 7 Indigenous data challenges. And the challenges were all co-designed by the Indigenous communities themselves. Next slide, please. And a successful example of this work is the Namuniac app by Tatus Letapo from the Samburu tribe in Kenya. His community is facing severe drought that is affecting their nomadic livelihoods. And the app he helped develop with an international team of young developers means blessing in the Samburu language. And it allows the community to map their own territory using local symbols instead of geographic coordinates. And through this, all tribal stakeholders have access to the knowledge that will help them to better adapt to these extreme weather events that they're experiencing, but also to create a local record of climate change as it is happening. Next slide, please. And since colonization, Indigenous communities have fought to have their voices heard and to be seen and acknowledged by their local governments. And Claudinette de Souza from the Quilombo community in the Brazilian Amazon addresses this through the Visibilidade app that has a simple user interface that encourages her community to share their stories with the rest of the world, to garner outside support and ensure that underrepresented communities have a say in public policies at both the local and state levels. And through this app, co-designed by Douglas Mbura from the Kisi tribe in Kenya and Rasha Nemiri from Sudan, they make visible the needs, hopes, and solutions of any community. Next slide, please. And we wanted to introduce a book that we've been working together with Allegra and the founders of the Geo-Indigenous Alliance, called Indigenizing Education for Climate Action, Strategies, Case Studies, and Testimonies. This book will provide both practical tools and applicable theories, as well as personal reflections on the topic of indigenizing education broadly, as well as methods for engaging youth in climate action projects. We aim to challenge deficit mindset that the educational and scientific communities often hold of Indigenous and other groups. We argue for holistic approaches to science education and new Indigenous methodologies for incorporating cutting-edge space technologies with local traditional knowledge to solve some of the most pressing socio-environmental challenges humanity is facing. We will be featuring a dozen authors from all over the world. And here are 3 that relate to the work you all are doing. So we hope you look out for them in the spring 2023, when we will publish the book. The first one is Indigenous-led educational approaches and the creative communication of climate custodianship by Dr. Michelle Catanzaro, Dr. Kaeli Joe Broker, and Madison Shakespeare from Western Sydney University and the University of Newcastle. And this important case study by First Nations can help to raise awareness about the important contribution that art can make to climate education and the power of visual communication that remains untapped. The second one is Decolonizing Data, the Movement for Indigenous Data Sovereignty by Dr. Autumn Asher Blackdeer from the University of Denver Indigenous data sovereignty is a vital framework for climate equity, and steps to decolonize data will be highly valuable for the climate change community and climate education. And the third one is learning on the land, lessons from an Indigenous-led field school by Jennifer Mathier from the University of Victoria. Why are we excited about this project? The international community needs more community-based and participatory case studies that are culturally sensitive in design and action research oriented. Next slide, please. And so to conclude, here are 3 ways you can support Indigenous communities in your work. You can seek out Indigenous authors and scholars, especially those in your field, and amplify their work in your citations and curriculum. Allegra is going to drop a list of resources in the chat box to get you started. You can advocate for Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty. You can begin this work by familiarizing yourself with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, also included in the resource that Allegra will provide. And you can learn about specific local Indigenous history of the places where you live and work. You can begin this work by including land acknowledgements in your course materials. And next slide, please. And here are our contact details. We would love to get in touch with you. And so please don't hesitate to reach out if you are interested in collaborating or in learning more. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. Goodness, sorry. So do we have any questions? I want to thank the presenters. I feel like there is such rich content here for service learning opportunities, for just getting students involved. I think that the development of political identities in whichever way possible. You know, there's a lot of resources there in the chat if you haven't already seen those. But are there any questions?
I wanted to make a comment and say just how overwhelmed I am with joy just to be able to hear this presentation and to see the excellent work that both of you have done to on behalf of Indigenous communities and for the scholarly work. I think this is a great start for many people. Now I know why Allegra has been talking about Diana all these years. It is great to meet you and to see the work that you're doing everywhere. I don't even know where to begin. I look forward to seeing some of the resources, and also I had to really take another look at that map. I was really kind of, it is a wonderful visual display of history and what has happened and what is happening worldwide. And I do commend the work that you're doing. What do you suggest is the major, I would say, natural resource that people need to focus on, or is it based on a particular region? Either one of you.
Yeah, so I think that I guess local and immediate is good. Like, I think the more relevant, the better. So whatever is most impacting. We started the presentation with that saying of life is water and land is our first teacher. So focusing on water and focusing on land is a really, really good start, I think, no matter where you are, because those issues affect everyone universally. So I would say that's a good place to start. Did you have any thoughts, Diana?
Yeah, I think every community sees their natural worlds differently, but they all have this holistic view. So it's a bit hard to just I say just water or just land. You know, they see it all holistically and spiritually as well. Yeah, so I guess the natural world in a holistic, under a holistic lens.
Right.
I feel like, to your point, Allegra, you had started with the idea of the land being your first teacher, and in many ways it's in listening to the land and what it is telling you, what it needs.
Right. I know I did a lot of work in the Central Valley of California. And within a 2-year period, I was able to see acres of land that were so lush with, fruits and vegetables. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful place to drive through. And within 2 years, I returned and it was a desert. And basically the water had to be redirected because there were shortages. I also grew up in Baja California, the other side of California, in Mexico. In my entire life, there has never been water in the dam. Water was always something that we had to purchase. And in our case, we had a little faucet outside, and there was constant herding of our dogs because people were always trying to come in, take the water, which, made a lot of sense. But I feel that water really is something that will probably lead to the next World War. I think it's getting to the point that, something's going to happen. And it's happening in this continent, even North America. And so, when you look at other continents and what they've gone through, it's kind of frightening. I think the indigenous way is the way to go in terms of honoring the earth and doing something about that. So I'm glad you raised the issue.
We have any other questions or contributions?
I just want to say thank you. I mean, I'm so grateful. I mean, now that we're approaching Thanksgiving, that talking about this and coming to this recognition is, I really appreciate having this session with Allegra and Diana. And this is a difficult topic for some people. When you talk about this, it's like, no, you don't have the authority to, because you're white, because you're white Texican, because you're this, because, but why we don't stop this hating on each other and trying to like participate actively in this conversation and be proactive. I mean, I'm so appreciative of having this conversation. I wish I'm gonna record this session. Please share it with me. Share it with these 2 instructors.
I'll send you the YouTube link as soon as it's ready, Alejandra. Like, we will load it onto our YouTube channel and we'll get that to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, because we are not, when I do have a percentage of my descent is Comanche and Apache. Of course, I am mixed with Spanish, but like some people feel like you don't have the authority to discuss this because you are not from that. I mean, it comes from cultural appropriation, but it's not. I mean, it's a topic that affects everybody, affects humanity. So I am very thankful that I was able to listen to this session. Thank you, Allegra.
I think to Alejandra's point, it is true that oftentimes people try to diminish our indigenous roots in North America. I basically identify as Native American, but in certain circles, you cannot say that of course, I'm Native American to this continent, right? But in terms of the USA, I'm not Native American in that I am not in a tribal role, you know. But, you know, we really have to fight back and tell people that they cannot tell us who we are, what our identity is, you know. And I'm proud of people that always do recognize. That's the reason I always put other, because I'm always given the choice. Are you Black? Are you white? And only when you get to ethnicity can you say Hispanic. But in terms of race, you know, that's, I guess, my own rebellion, you know, saying, you know, I know what I am. But if I go and say that I'm Asian or Native American, I would be challenged as, you know, lying or not being honest or things of that nature. But no, I think we just have to stand firm. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, fantastic reminder as we come up on National Day of Mourning. As you mentioned, it is Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month. Great reminder for the kind of action that we should be thinking about every single day. So thank you so much to Diana and to Allegra. So I'm not sure if there are any other questions. We can hang out for a few minutes. We still have some time. Just as a reminder, we will not have a December webinar just because of finals and the holidays, winter break coming up. We will pick back up in January when we will be talking to Dr. Rafael Castillo. And so we will look forward to that for everyone who celebrates. I know that there are dozens of holidays between Thanksgiving and New Year. So whatever you celebrate, I hope that you have a joyous season. And again, thank you to Diana and to Allegra.
Allegra, do you have specific lesson plans that you think can be used within our framework and seminars? One question, and then the second question, are you guys willing to take the show on the road to other institutions?
I'll answer the first one, Dan, and you can answer the second one. Yeah, there's a lot of resources. So the annotated bibliography that I shared is just kind of the starting point. But kind of in each of those resources, there's like a lot of different ways to engage in these conversations, a lot of discussion questions and reflections and anticipatory sets and lesson plans and things like that kind of embedded in. The first couple of resources in that annotated bibliography are OER, and they're full-length books. And so there's a lot of different contributing authors and there's lots of really great material. So I would say that's the starting point. But yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a lot of material out there. And Dan and I are also working with other Indigenous scholars and practitioners right now. So they have a lot of really great ideas as well. Well, hopefully we'll be able to highlight those and emphasize those. And Dan, are we taking this on the road or?
Yeah, we would love to. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right.
Diana's, by the way, zooming in from Prague. So it's like almost 10 o'clock
Yeah,
there. So
that's great.
yeah. So
Thank
it's
you.
wonderful
Oh my
to
God,
meet
I'm
you.
that, Diana.
jealous.
Yes.
I know in Prague it's probably like not that long after dinner time, but still, thank you very much.
No worries. I'm really honored to be with you here today.
Thank you.
Excellent.
What time it is, Diana, over there?
It's 10:49.
Oh, wow. Okay. So whatever we do, we have to do it early in the day. So you can get some sleep. Yes. That's wonderful. Well, it's a great presentation. You know, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Allegra, for coordinating that. And